and I'm sitting in the living room of Mr. and Mrs. C.B. Buchanan at 229 South 17th Street in Terre Haute, Indiana. Mr. Buchanan is a retired newspaper man, and before he drifted into newspaper work, he used to be on the stage as a comic and a dancer. What we're going to talk about today is some of his experiences in Oklahoma during the oil field rush. And Mr. Buchanan, it was about in 1926 that you headed for Borger, Texas. Is that right?
That's correct. I was in Borger, and it was an unusual experience because Borger had gotten out of control. The crime and prostitution and bootlegging and gambling and so forth had gotten out of hand as far as the local authorities were concerned.
Yes.
Even they were involved in it. And finally the Texas Rangers came in and closed the town up. They just went down the street and they'd tack up a sign, "This place closed by order of the Texas Rangers."
Mm-hmm. And
they closed everything up, even put the police chief in jail.
Uh-huh.
And Borger was then left with just ordinary citizens after they ran all of their roughnecks out. Well, I didn't exactly know which way to go. I believe it was a hotel clerk that told me that the big boom was going on at Seminole. So I left there. And of course, in those days, what they would call a good highway was all gravel.
Uh-huh.
It was all mud, mostly.
Mr. Buchanan, I want to ask you, had you been sent to Borger by your newspaper?
No.
How did it happen you were there?
I was just traveling around like a tramp printer, trying to so forth. And I was also interested in show business. I had done some dancing.
So you were just on your own in Borger? Okay.
Just rambling.
I see, okay.
And the dirt roads were so bad that, and you couldn't get a map in those days. You couldn't stop at a filling station and get a map.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd ask directions and they'd tell you what road to take. Now, I think it took me about 2 days to get to Seminole from Borger.
You were traveling in your Model T.
Model T Ford.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You had to crank it.
Uh-huh.
There wasn't any starter on it. And
were there gas stations along the way, or?
Very few,
Uh-huh.
very few. And most of them were a grocery store with a gas pump.
I see.
Well, I got into Seminole, and it was, something entirely different that I'd ever seen before. Nothing but mud, just mud. And I never saw so many drunks in all of my life. And bootleg places all over the place. You could go in any drugstore and get something to drink.
Uh-huh. What kind of drinks were available? What was everyone drinking?
Corn whiskey, or in the drugstore, you'd buy Jamaica ginger.
Uh-huh.
You get a little bottle of Jamaica ginger and mix it with Coca-Cola.
Wasn't that kind of dangerous, Jamaica ginger?
The original wasn't dangerous, but a lot of the bootleggers got into making their own.
Oh.
And that caused a lot of sickness and crippled people.
It caused people to be crippled?
Yeah, they called them Jake legs.
I see, because they had gotten that ailment from the Jamaica ginger.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And Seminole was quite a rough town. But the dance halls and everything, the people were nice, but they were just rough,
Mm-hmm.
In fact, short time I was there, I acquired a nickname of Jelly Bean because I wore a necktie.
Uh-huh.
And these roughnecks, I was young, and they'd kid me, you know. I'd go down to one of these dance halls, and they'd say, "Hey, Jelly Bean, come over here. I want to talk to you." So one night, I remember I was up in this little old hotel. There wasn't any locks on the doors. And 2 or 3 of these roughnecks came up and come bouncing in the room, and I was in bed in my pajamas. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning, I guess. And they said, "Come on, Jelly Bean, we're going out here to an all-night joint." I said, "Oh, no, I'm going to bed. I'm in bed. I'm going to sleep." They just got the 4 corners of the covers, picked me up, put me over their shoulder, took me out and put me in an old touring car and drove me about 2 or 3 miles outside of Seminole to an all-night dance hall. And they took care of me in there and set me down at the table and took my blanket off, and I was sitting there in my pajamas. And they'd yell over and say, "Hey, bring the Jelly Bean a little drink, will you?" They were rough. You had to like it.
Were you scared?
Of course I was scared.
Wow.
But you didn't exactly get mad at them.
Yeah. Had to be careful. Huh?
They were nice.
Sure.
They were just having a lot of fun.
Mr. Buchanan, I'd like to have you go back a little bit and see if you can recreate that scene for me as you came into Seminole. You were talking about a big lineup of cars there.
Yes.
And were there people on the street?
Oh, yes. Just wandering all direction and mud clear over your ankles.
And what kind of people were they? Were they all roughnecks?
Oil field workers, rig workers, what they call roustabouts and roughnecks that worked on the oil rigs. And
how were they dressed?
Old jeans, blue shirts, mackinaws, you know.
Knapsacks?
Yeah. But the streets were so muddy that cars would just slide around each other going down the street. And
nothing was paved.
Oh, no. No, they didn't even have any sidewalks. They had boards laid down to walk along. And I think I told you before that there was one car parked, stuck right in the middle of the street. And that thing stayed there for about 2 or 3 weeks. Nobody paid any attention to it. They just drive around it. I don't know who it belonged to. I don't think anybody else did either.
Were there any women on the streets?
Yes. There was a lot of women there.
Who were they? Where did they come from?
Well, most of them were following the booms. Of course, there was people there that had stores and things like that, but I'm talking about the crowds on the street.
You mean these women were prostitutes?
Yes.
And they had come from all
Well, not all of them were prostitutes. Some of them were dance hall girls that worked just for the chips, and they'd cash those chips. And you see, at first, you could go up and buy a drink at the bar, and they'd give you a chip. And that chip entitled you to dance with one of the girls.
Okay.
They had a big rail around the dance floor. Band sat at one end, and they had these openings there, gateways. And the girls walked around and showed themselves off in the center, walked the rail. And the guy would just reach over and tap her. That meant that he chose her and he wanted to dance. So he'd go dance and give her this chip. Well, the dance only lasted 2 courses, you know.
Uh-huh.
And
It was just 64 bars, wasn't
That's
it?
right, 64 bars of music, and then this walker, they had a man that walked the floor on the inside of the rail. His job was to watch the girls and saw that they kept moving and to control things. And when the music stopped, he'd yell, "Up to the bar, boys." And then everybody'd go up and buy another drink and get another chip.
How much did a chip cost?
25 cents.
Uh-huh.
And the girls in those days, $100 a week was an awful lot of money.
Uh-huh.
That would be equivalent to about $500 a week now.
Sure.
And that's what the dance hall girls made. They made about $100 a week.
Was that in salary or tips or both?
All in chips. They got no salary.
Oh, okay.
They worked just for those chips that they would get. And every once in a while, maybe the walker would yell, "Give the boys a free one." And then they'd play 16 bars of music. No, 32 bars of music, one course. And then up to the bar, boys.
And didn't you say that those chips were the origin of the word chippy, which
They started calling the girls chippies because they worked for the chips.
Uh-huh.
And
So
then things got pretty much out of hand. And they tried to clean it up a little bit, so they stopped the bootlegging in the dance halls. They didn't stop the bootlegging. I mean, they stopped them from selling it over the bar in the open. So then you'd have to go up and buy the chip over the bar. If you wanted a drink, well, they'd sneak you a drink or a bottle underneath the bar. And they also had doormen, or I guess nowadays you'd call them bouncers, standing at the two entrances. And they also carried a jug on them. And they'd either sell you a bottle or they would sell you a drink out of their bottle. You know, any way to get the money. And no such thing as a restroom. They had an outhouse, you know, great big one. And the musicians, they played from about 5 o'clock in the afternoon until 2 or 3 in the morning. Without any intermission, they just kept playing. And I think I mentioned to you, Jack Teagarden of Jack Teagarden's orchestra was there.
Oh, yes. Now, he played what instrument?
Trombone.
Trombonist. He's nationally famous, isn't he?
Yes, he had his own band, Jack Teagarden, his band. And Tommy Warner was another famous musician. It was Gene Gifford that later started the Casa Loma Orchestra.
Oh, yes.
Gene Gifford was playing there at the dance hall. And a dance hall opened there called Maddie's Hall. And Maddie was a woman that had a hall at Borger. The Rangers closed it up, and then she came down there and opened up a dance hall. But the musicians would have to eat or get a drink or go to the restroom by leaving the bandstand one at a time. They'd have to leave somebody up there playing because they kept the music going all of the time in order to keep the shekels coming in, you know. But it was no problem to get a drink. There wasn't any such thing as hiding it. But they got to the point where they just wouldn't serve it to you over the bar. But it was wild and rough. And so many people were living in tents. Just as far as you could see out on a field, there'd be little teeny pup tent like, or a large tent where maybe 6, 7 people, 8 people living in.
So that was part of the scene that you saw as you came in.
Yes,
to Seminole.
the houses that people lived in were few and far between. they had been farmhouses, and they hadn't gotten around to building any homes there hardly yet.
What do you suppose the population of Seminole was before this influx of people?
I wondered about that. There were just so many people downtown, just crowded around. It would be hard to guess. One time I thought maybe 20,000, but I don't believe so. I don't believe it was that many because the town was only about 8 blocks long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the nicer section of town, it was about 5 blocks, called High Town. They referred to it as High Town.
Mm-hmm.
And in it wasn't a valley of the other 3 blocks. It was just down a little grade. Anyway, they nicknamed it Shanker Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the rough section.
Mm-hmm.
You had 2 burlesque theaters in town. They ran 4 shows a day and sometimes 5. And one of them in High Town was a fairly good show for a burlesque show.
Mm-hmm.
But the other one in Shanker Valley was pretty rough and rugged.
Mm-hmm.
If you were easily offended, you didn't go in there. You know, they didn't have any seats. They just had benches.
Uh-huh.
Just go in and sit in the stage. No changes of scenery or anything.
Uh-huh.
They just had one curtain that would go up and down. When an act got through, they went off. Had a little box dressing room on one side for the ladies, the box dressing room on the other side for the men.
How much did it cost to get in there?
$1.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a lot of money then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And things we thought were very high. You had to pay $1 for a dinner.
Mm-hmm.
In those days, we thought, well, anywhere else you'd get a plate lunch special for 30 cents, you know.
But did places like the burlesque show, did those spring up as a result of the oil boom, or were they already there?
No, as a result of the boom.
Uh-huh. So burlesque shows and maybe hotels and tent cities and what about food? Were there new restaurants or just sort of street vendors? Or?
No, they had restaurants, but they weren't fancy, you know. Just thrown up frame buildings with a kitchen, but you could get good food, steaks, because those roughnecks ate.
They ate heartily, didn't they?
Yes.
Uh-huh. It sounded to me from what you were saying as though this town was alive all night.
It was.
It doesn't sound like they ever went to bed.
Well, they worked all night.
Oh, they worked all night.
Oil, they drilled all night long. The crews worked different shifts.
I see.
And there was derricks all around the town.
Uh-huh.
Everywhere you'd look, there'd be an oil derrick.
Uh-huh.
And those fellows worked very hard. And when they played very hard.
So the entertainment in the town for these oil hands was the burlesque show and the dance halls and eating and the prostitutes.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the prostitutes are concerned, you'd be walking down the street and they'd just reach over and tap you on the shoulder and proposition you right on the street. You know. They might come up to you in the restaurant or in the drugstore and proposition you.
Pretty brazen.
Yes. Well, I imagine the police chief was getting paid off too. That's the way it was at Borger.
It sounds, Mr. Buchanan, as though some of the prices were really inflated because of the oil boom in Seminole. Do you have any idea how much the Roughnecks made a week?
I don't know, but I imagine it was around $100 a week because they seemed to have plenty of money. There was a lot of rich people there.
In Seminole?
a lot of very suddenly rich people,
Uh-huh.
people that owned land, that they had oil rigs drilling oil on,
Mm-hmm.
and Indians that had come into money because of their tribes having land around Seminole.
Mm-hmm.
And one man in particular that moved to Tulsa. Now this, I don't know whether it should be published or not. I think he's dead, but his family may not like it.
Mm-hmm.
His name was Art Olson,
Mm-hmm.
and he became very wealthy and owned the Olson Oil Drilling Company,
Mm-hmm.
and became a multimillionaire.
And he was an Indian.
No,
Oh, he wasn't
No.
an Indian. Okay.
but Art Olson, in I believe it was 29, he was drunk in Tulsa and ran over a man downtown and killed him. And they took Art down and arrested him, and due to his money, he was released inside of an hour. The attorney got him out. So then they treated him nice at the police station. So then Art went out, and the rumor goes that he fixed the family up independently for life. So by bestowing a fortune on the victim's family, he came out of it clean as a whistle.
Mm-hmm.
So then after that, every time that Art would get drunk, he'd go to a jewelry store and buy $4 or $5, $300 or $400 watches with diamonds in them, and go down to the police station and start handing out watches. And it got to where the boys laughed about it, because everybody at the police station owned a $300 or $400 watch given to him by Art Olson. If one of them got 2 watches, well, he'd go give it to somebody that didn't have one. I don't know whether his family would appreciate that being known or not, but it's very true, because I knew Art Olson personally. Was out to his home, and he had a marvelous sense of humor. Always wanted to have a good time. And he hired myself and 2 other fellows to stand at the door at a big party that he gave. And the minute the guest, it was all stag, this party was, the minute the guest would walk in the door, one of the boys would take his coat off, and I would spray him with a flit gun underneath his arms and between his legs and everything, and then tell him he was all right to go shake hands with him, Mr. Olson.
Oh, dear.
He was, and another very wealthy person there was the Phillips boys that owned the Phillips Petroleum Company, the Phillips 66. Well, they were very tight with their money, but they gave a lot of money away. They gave museums in Oklahoma and art galleries and everything. But they were throwing a party at the Mayo Hotel, and the owner of the hotel, John Mayo, lived up on the top floor. And whiskey wasn't legal then. It was legal in some states, but not in Oklahoma. It had just become legal in some states. No, I take that back. It was beer. But they were drinking whiskey and being served by the hotel. And every time that the waiter would bring them drinks and things, well, Art had a little, not Art, I'm getting my stories mixed up. It was John Phillips. John would take a pencil and mark down the drink and how much each drink was. So during the course of the evening, his list became pretty long. And when they got ready to go, well, the waiter brought Mr. Phillips his bill. And he totaled up his bill, and it didn't coincide. And he accused the waiter of padding his check.
Mm-hmm.
The waiter insisted that he did not. So Mr. Phillips says, well, I refuse to pay this. You get John Mayo down here. I want to talk to him. Well, it was late at night, and he wouldn't pay the bill until John Mayo got down there. They went and got John Mayo out of bed, and he came down to see Mr. Phillips. So Mr. Phillips told him that the waiter had padded the bill, and he wanted that taken off and made right. And Mr. Mayo looked at the bill, and he said, well, Mr. Phillips, he said, with all your money, you're quibbling about $2. And John Phillips says, I don't care if it's a dime. I'm not paying it.
Mm-hmm.
So Mr. Mayo just reached over and got the check and tore it in two and said, this party's on me, John. Because they didn't want to make enemies with Mr. Phillips. That's pretty tight with money.
Yes, it is.
When you work many millions.
Speaking of money, the story that you mentioned about the Cadillac car dealer is something kind of fun that I'd like for you to share with us.
Oh, yes. And one of those incidents, a fellow that he came in and looked over a Cadillac, and he bought one.
Was this a farmer or?
Yes,
a farmer. Okay.
And paid cash for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't recall the name because I had the opportunity to meet him personally. But he went over and he looked at the car for a minute that he just bought, and he came back and bought 5 more Cadillacs, one for each one of his children.
What did a Cadillac cost in those days?
Oh, about, I'd say $2,500, $3,000. I don't believe it was quite $3,000. But later on, I went to Shawnee, which is pretty close to Seminole. And it was booming too, but not like the big boom at Seminole.
Was the scene in Shawnee similar?
No, they had paved streets, and it was a nice town, you know. But the reason I said that I happened to meet the man that bought the 5 Cadillacs is because I dated his daughter.
I see.
And they live between Seminole and Shawnee. And I had several dates with his daughter.
I see.
So I knew that to be the truth because I rode in their Cadillac. Oh, and I'll tell you something, talk about sudden rich people. She wanted to go to Oklahoma City to go shopping and wanted me to go with her. So I did, and she asked me to drive, and I drove. We went over to Oklahoma City, and when we got out, we started to go in the store, and she handed me a roll of bills that you couldn't hardly fold up into your pocket. And she said, I know it would look funny for me paying for everything. Said, you pay for everything while we're shopping. So I carried that big wad of bills around and paid everything. I felt rich.
I bet you did. What about that story about the Indian that bought the Cadillac?
Yes. Well, you didn't have to have an automobile license to drive a car then.
Oh, you didn't?
No, you could buy a car and just get in and drive off.
And did the car dealers have fancy showrooms in those days?
No, this was a shed.
A shed.
They had gravel and this roof, and they drive the cars up under the shed, and you look around. They didn't have any showrooms like that.
Okay.
But this full-blooded Indian came in there and had two girls with him, and he bought a brand new Cadillac, and he didn't know how to drive it. And the salesman spent a while with him, showing him how to shift gears. They didn't have automatic transmissions then. And he showed him where to put the gear, to push the clutch in, and everything. He kept working with it and working with it, and finally he thought, well, he's able to drive it. Get him out of here anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So the Indian and the two girls got in the Cadillac and drove off down the street. They got just down at the edge of town, about a quarter of a mile, and he ratted off of the road and nosed it down into a big ditch. And he was thoroughly disgusted, I guess, about that, so he just got out and left the Cadillac, and he and the two girls came back and bought a new Cadillac.
Wow.
That's having money just burned, isn't it?
It sure is. Where did the dance hall girls live? Were there hotels there?
No. Now, one, I mentioned a large tent. They had a big tent, well, you've seen like army tents.
Uh-huh.
Maybe about, I'd say 20 feet wide and 40 feet long.
Uh-huh.
And the girls had cots and would sleep in there.
So some business person set up the tent and they had to pay for the cots? Is that the way it
Well,
worked?
for instance, like where the dance hall girls stayed, the dance hall furnished the tent.
Oh, okay.
See, they got their living quarters.
Uh-huh.
And, but the hotels, there wasn't